Good afternoon. Thank you. We're just about to begin. If you can take your seats, please. Thank you. Well, and with this good afternoon, we're about to begin one of our premier events of the conference. I've been honored to have the distinction to introduce Dr. Maria Rosario Jackson, the chair of the National Endowment for the Arts. So if you could please stay with me for a few minutes, I'd like to render our honor with a brief introduction. For more than 25 years, Dr. Maria Rosario Jackson's work has focused on understanding and elevating arts, culture, and design as critical elements of healthy communities. Her works blends social and arts humanities-based approaches to comprehensive community revitalization, systems change, the dynamics of race and ethnicity, and the roles of arts and culture in communities. After confirmation by the U.S. Senate in December of 2021, Dr. Jackson became the 13th chair of the National Endowment for the Arts in January 2022. With this historic appointment, Dr. Jackson is the first African American and Mexican American woman to serve as chair of the NEA. Dr. Jackson, thank you. Dr. Jackson is currently on leave from Arizona State University, where she is a tenure institute professor in the Herberger Institute for Design in the Arts, Place and Equitable Communities. For 18 years, Dr. Jackson worked at the Urban Institute, a Washington-based national public policy research organization. Dr. Jackson was appointed to the National Council on the Arts by President Barack Obama in 2012. Where she served until becoming chair of the NEA. Dr. Jackson was co-chair of the County of Los Angeles Cultural Equity and Inclusion Initiative, and most recently served as on the advisory board of the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, the Equity Center at the University of Virginia, and other notable boards advancing the role of the arts in communities. A graduate of the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, with a doctorate in urban planning, Dr. Jackson holds a Master's of Public Administration degree for the University of Southern California. Dr. Jackson grew up in Los Angeles and as a child spent summers in her mother's hometown of Mexico City and visited her father's home state of Ohio. Her love of the arts stems from her parents who encouraged Dr. Jackson and her brother to learn about the richness of their cultures through the arts. She lived in Washington, D.C. for 20 years and currently resides in her native Los Angeles with her husband, David Riddick, and in Phoenix, Arizona. She is a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority, Inc. And with that, please put your hands together and join me in welcoming Dr. Maria Rosario Jackson.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. So thank you, Lonel, for that warm welcome and introduction. And I'm delighted to join you for this National Rural Housing Conference and to share some thoughts with you about the importance of arts, culture, and design in rural communities. It's been an honor and a privilege to have been appointed by President Biden to serve as chair of the National Endowment for the Arts. and I've been in my position for not quite 2 years now. It's an interesting time to serve from this perch. It's a challenging time, to be sure, coming out of a global pandemic, exacerbated inequities in communities that were already marginalized, heightened awareness of injustice, a fractured political reality that jeopardizes our democracy, global instability, impacts of climate change. But it's also a time of opportunity, shaped by 3 years of questioning our orthodoxies as we survive the pandemic, evidence of new ways of working and organizing our lives, people calling out injustice and daring to do something about it, President Biden's executive order on racial justice in historically marginalized communities, and the administration's priorities on climate and unifying our country. Whether we like it or not, we're also in a time when we're summoned to set the foundation for the next version of our communities and the sectors we work in, including the arts, housing, and community development. I find that in times when you have to question everything, you also arrive at a better understanding of what is essential, what's not negotiable, what is fundamental. And as I stand before you, one thing I know for sure is that none of the things that we say that we aspire to as a nation of opportunity and justice are possible without the integration of arts, culture, and design into all facets of our lives and the systems we rely on to care for each other. The arts help us make sense of the world, offer us different ways of thinking, feeling, and being. They're a source of inspiration and innovation. They help us see our commonalities and our meaningful differences. They help us protect and advance our humanity and that of our neighbors. The arts are critically important to our well-being as individuals, as communities, and as a country. My commitment to the arts started early, and it started at home. My parents turned to artistic expression as a way to help them raise my brother and me, 2 little black and brown kids, to be proud of our cultures. They wanted us to understand where they and we came from. They wanted us to know that our history was rich and complex. They wanted us to be proud of our backgrounds as well as curious about others, to understand similarities and differences, and to recognize our common humanity. For the better part of 30 years, from different perches, my work has been at the intersection of arts and culture and comprehensive community development and planning. Early in my career, in planning, community development, and public policy, I was sometimes discouraged from my focus on arts and culture. I would have well-meaning colleagues say, "You care about the causes and consequences of injustice. You want to address racist structures and improve neighborhoods. Why are you doing this arts and culture stuff?" As if it was off mission. And the question annoyed me, but I remained committed. And I didn't have the words to explain myself early in my career, but eventually I found those words. And what I've been able to say for a number of years now is that if you look around the world and throughout the ages, in strategies to disempower, the first thing that is tampered with is one's ability to make meaning, to ask questions, to have aesthetics, to express yourself creatively, to do the things that we do through art. So if something is so powerful that it has to be tampered with in order to control or oppress, why don't we understand it as core to building? The questions about why I wasn't focused on housing or economic development or food insecurity also bothered me because I didn't see the arts as existing in a silo and not relevant to those issues. After all, doesn't affordable housing require good design? Don't the arts impact business? Aren't artists also often entrepreneurs? The arts are integral to holistically revitalizing our communities in myriad ways. And I believe that they're most impactful arts and culture don't exist in isolation. They're woven throughout, not icing on the cake, but a critically important element of the batter. For many years, I've abided by a set of guiding principles that undergird my work and the understanding of roles of arts and culture in community development. And I'll share these with you now. First, the ability for all people to make sense of the world, to own their own stories, and be creatively expressive on their own terms is a key element of justice, equity, and a healthy existence. It's core to the American ethos that we profess. Second, our concept of art and cultural engagement has to be expansive. It includes, very importantly, professional production for consumption of art, but it can't only be limited to that. It must also include making, doing, teaching, learning, so many other verbs. It has to include art as part of our daily lived existence. Third, we have to recognize that art process can be as important as, or in some cases even more important than, art product. In fact, I'm pleased to share that the NEA has added creative process to our definition of artistic excellence in our guidelines as we're emphasizing the experience of making art more. Fourth, artists, culture bearers, and designers have many kinds of critically important relationships with publics. And by extension, they use many and varied ways of creating their careers beyond the too few and narrow paths that have been paved. Last, the arts are intrinsically valuable, full stop. At the same time, they're critical elements of other community dynamics, needs, and aspirations, including those deeply connected to building healthy communities where all people can thrive. Grounded in these principles and mindful of the complex state of the sector, I've been advancing the idea of artful lives. It's an inclusive concept that includes a wide range of arts experiences, from consuming professional offerings at museums, theaters, and concert halls, to everyday, deeply meaningful arts practices and expressions. Providing opportunities for all people to live artful lives requires that the sector focus on equity, justice, and lived experience. In addition to artful lives, I've also been talking about how unleashing the full power of the art requires it to not just exist in isolation and separate from the rest of one's lives, but integrate it into them, and integrate it into the systems and mechanisms that we rely on to care for each other. Art-based strategies for comprehensive community development take many forms. Working with artists and arts organizations can lead to enhanced citizen involvement in planning. Recognizing the cultural assets of a community and building on those can lead to enhanced social cohesion, pride and stewardship of place, as well as economic development. Increasingly, there's evidence that arts engagement is important for better physical and mental health outcomes. We know this from our work with the Department of the Defense and Department of Veterans Affairs through our Creative Forces initiative that deals with military personnel and veterans who have issues with trauma, and the use of the arts for healing from that. Recently, the Surgeon General has been lifting up social isolation as a health crisis. He's also begun to look at the arts as a way of combating that, and there are many more examples. Examples from arts bolstering efforts to heal the planet, to the arts playing key roles in community and individual well-being. These ideas are impacting how the NEA is and will be showing up. We'll continue to be a funder, which is how we're known primarily, but we'll also emphasize our role as a national resource that contributes to building healthy communities where all people can thrive, where people can lead artful lives, and where the important work happening at the intersection of arts of other fields of policy and practice is strengthened and advanced. So what does that have to do with building rural communities? A lot. The Housing Assistance Council partners with the NEA to run what we call the Citizens Institute on Rural Design, or CIRD, focusing on communities with populations of 50,000 or less. CIRD's goal is to enhance the quality of life and economic viability of rural America through planning, design, and creative placemaking. CIRD is intended to empower local residents to capitalize on unique local and regional assets in order to guide the civic development and future design of their communities. In the most recent announcement of communities selected to take part in this program, design assistance will be provided to Boswell, Indiana, population 800, where they're taking on an ambitious project to create a community hub at a former elementary school site. The project includes repurposing the building for sustainable community-based economic opportunities, potential housing, and green space. Mount Sterling, Kentucky, population 7,545, is looking to revitalize a part of their historic downtown with public art, community gathering spaces, and recreational activities. In Two Harbors, Minnesota, population 3,621, a group of committed volunteers is spearheading a well-timed project with potential to transform a 47-acre waterfront parcel on Lake Superior. The revitalization will transform a neglected and environmentally degraded area into an asset for all. And these are just a few examples. We've also seen CIRD communities start with the seed of an idea and go on to garner support from the NEA and other sources. The Navajo Townsite CDC in Navajo, New Mexico, joined CRD's Design Learning Cohort in 2021 with a whole host of questions and thoughts about how to revitalize their community. And since then, they've begun to win support across a range of projects, including affordable housing grants and an NEA Our Town Award for an arts and culture master plan that will knit together public spaces across the community. The Snow Pond Center for the Arts in Sydney, Maine, joined the first iteration of the Design Learning Cohort in 2019 with the goal of attracting and retaining young residents and families with an interest in the arts. Through CIRD connections and with the NEA Our Town support, they secured the services of a landscape architect who's been shepherding them through an intentional community development project, which will be a one-of-a-kind rural arts district and artist workforce housing project. I'm very proud of the work the NEA has done through the CIRD program. It's been in existence for 32 years, and it's still in demand because it works. The arts are good design matter for a lot of reasons. The arts are good, and design creates a sense of belonging. They create opportunities for physical health and multi-generational well-being. They address challenges and opportunities in communities through inspiring, innovative work. And they highlight and often celebrate the culture that exists across rural America. At the NEA, our reach in rural communities extends beyond CRD. In fact, many of our National Heritage Fellows come from rural communities. As part of the White House's United We Stand initiative, we've also supported an effort to combat hate-fueled violence. The NEA supported Uvalde Love Project, which used mural creation to help with community healing after a school shooting in rural Texas. America's rural communities are rich in artistic and cultural traditions and practices, which we can draw on to strengthen our communities and bind us closer through our shared experience and deeper understanding of our differences. Earlier this year, President Biden called artists truth tellers, bridge builders, and change seekers. These are necessary roles and functions in community development. We need artists and the arts now more than ever. This is a time for those who don't usually work with the arts sector to try something new. It's a time for those who have their experiences with the arts sector be bolstered and practices shared. Please know that the NEA is here to take this journey with you as we innovate, get unstuck, dream big together, and truly make a difference. Thank you for all you do, and thank you for listening.
I'm Jonathan Harwitz. I'm HAC's Director of Public Policy, and I just want to ask folks to thank Dr. Jackson once again for really amazing remarks. I have to say, I want to thank her, but it threw me off my game a little bit because she gave me so much to think about from those remarks, and I just do want to say one thing. I was privileged enough to work at the Department of Housing and Urban Development during the Obama-Biden administration. I need to thank my colleagues, former colleagues at the NEA, for helping me to understand that arts, culture, and design has to be part of the batter for the cake and not just the icing, although I'm on record as loving icing as well. So thank you, Dr. Jackson. For also centering, I think of this as the place-based plenary because we're centering place. We always center people here at HAC and with this work, but I think Dr. Jackson's address and this part of the plenary that I'm privileged to be part of really centers place, and I am so happy to be introducing our next plenary speaker, Professor Kathryn Edin, to talk about the book Injustice of Place, which you all should have received, which she co-authored with Luke Schaefer and Tim Nelson. As one does when there is a book about places around the country, and as you all know, this book is focused on places of the greatest distress and disadvantage, but also places of the greatest advantage. And Professor Edin and I were talking about where we were from, respectively. She's from Staples, Minnesota, a small rural town in Minnesota. I'm from Buffalo, New York. And I appreciate that little shout out from my CEO. And it was interesting. This book talks about really the 200 most distressed, disadvantaged places and the 200 most advantaged places. And what was interesting was that when I was growing up, Buffalo had 3 major sports teams. It was because that's considered sort of a major city. But as we looked at the list of most advantaged and most disadvantaged places, Buffalo is one of the few cities to appear in the 150 most disadvantaged, along with a number of other Rust Belt cities, while Professor Edin's hometown is among the most advantaged. And that made me feel much better because as I looked at Dr. Edin's resume, I was like, well, of course she's so much more accomplished than me. I had to overcome so much more. So with that, let me proceed to introduce Professor Edin, who is the William Church Osborne Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, where she is also the director of the Bendheim Thoman Center for Research on Child and Well-Being. She's the author of 8 books, including $2 a Day, The Art of Living on Virtually Nothing in America, which won national acclaim for its portrait of poverty in post-welfare reform America, and certainly made me, among many others, a fanboy of her work. Lesser known, though, and relevant to the conversation we'll have later, is Professor Edin's long history of housing-related research. From the original study of deconcentration of poverty from the Gattro Housing Authority desegregation case to the Moving to Opportunity initiative at HUD in the 1990s, has led Professor Edin to be involved for many years in studying both the quantitative and qualitative impacts of housing stability on adults and children. And it's that compelling combination of both rigorous quantitative analysis and rich, insightful qualitative research. In plain English, that means asking people questions about their lives and listening to the answers that makes the injustice of place so compelling and me so excited to welcome Professor Edin to the stage.
my clicker. Okay, I think we can go to the PowerPoint. Good afternoon. I feel at home. I am from rural America, and proudly so, and my mother is an artist. And I've always been nurtured by art in my home and in my community. So in 2015, Luke Schaefer and I published a book about America's most disadvantaged people called $2 a Day. And we went on a book tour, as we're doing now with this book, and talked to hundreds and hundreds of groups like yours about these folks and how they were living virtually cashless lives. But shortly after that, we got an email from a program officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. This, by the way, never happens. People don't call and offer you money. But she said, would you be willing to work on a book focused not on America's most disadvantaged people, but on America's most disadvantaged places? Now, immediately, this really appealed to us. But we had to figure out first how to measure a disadvantaged place. And you might notice that I'm using the word disadvantaged rather than the word poor. And I'm doing that on purpose. Because when we talk about place-based outcomes for people, people don't often choose where they get to grow up. And so disadvantage implies an injustice. People are being held back unfairly. If you will, it is a moral term. So as we set out to figure out how to measure disadvantaged places, we had to incorporate some notion, something to capture that people were being held back unfairly. And that means we had to move beyond standard poverty measures and incorporate much more of our nation's data infrastructure on disadvantage itself. So these are the 5 measures we use to construct what we call our index of deep disadvantage, and you can go online, theinjusticeofplace.com, and find your community and learn all about your community in an interactive way. But we really wanted our index to represent 3 different aspects of disadvantage. First, of course, poverty. Poverty tracks very closely with material hardships, so we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And it's cyclical. It rises and falls with the economy. Because we'd written about deep poverty or virtually cashless lives, we also wanted some measure of how many people were deeply poor within a place. But we know that poverty gets under the skin. And just because you're out of a spell of poverty doesn't mean that you're not suffering, that you're not still being held back unfairly. So we included 2 well-measured aspects of health: low birth weight, and this is a great measure because mothers carry their disadvantage into the birthing experience, which is reflected in the birth weight of their babies. But low birth weight is also predictive of children's outcomes, actually throughout the life course. And the level of life expectancy in a place. How long could you expect to live in one community versus the other? We know that gap can be up to 50, even 20 years across our many counties and cities in the U.S. But we also wanted to measure the structure of a place. And so if you're a high school graduate in Humphrey County's Mississippi, one place that we've been studying, you'll probably have to work at the catfish plant. But if you have a high school degree in Boston, Massachusetts, you have many more opportunities. You will be much less likely to be held back unfairly. So we used a machine learning technique to assign scores to all of these measures, and we ranked every county. There are 3,100 counties in the United States, and all of the 500 largest cities, and we literally ranked them. And this is the first time rural America has been included in this kind of study. Because we're using counties and not neighborhoods, we're able to encompass rural as well as urban America. Now you can imagine, I was 18 years old when I left my hometown of Staples, Minnesota. If you've never heard of it, I don't know what's wrong with you, but it's right in the geographic center or the belly button of the state. Anyway, I left at 18, I got in an Amtrak train, went to Chicago, and never looked back. I always said to myself, I'm never going to study rural poverty. I'm an urban person. So you can imagine how I reacted when this was the map that our ranking revealed. I was going to study rural America. So you'll also notice there's strong geographic concentration. I was just talking to somebody from the old tobacco belt, and you'll see that featured here. Most centrally, of course, in the Carolinas, coming down from Virginia through to South Carolina, the PD region. The second and largest by far region is the historic Cotton Belt. Fully 60 of the 100 most disadvantaged places in the nation are in the Cotton Belt, and I know many of you here are from the Cotton Belt, including two of my seatmates here. Central Appalachia, and this is eastern Kentucky and western West Virginia, a distinctly disadvantaged region, even more so than the rest of coal country. South Texas, incredibly disadvantaged, some of the highest poverty rates in the nation. They have a little bit better health outcomes and more mobility, but they are very, very poor communities. Of course, Uvalde is one of those communities in South Texas. And finally, Native nations. We are not able to feature ethnographically Native nations in this book, but in some ways the stories of Native nations and the violent dispossession of land make all of the story in this book possible. So what were we going to do to get some purchase on this story of disadvantage, which of course is concentrated in all the places you study, not the places I was studying? So 2 of the 3 authors of this book are ethnographers, meaning we go out and talk to them type people. And so when we put our heads together, we decided we need to send a team of people out to live and experience these communities firsthand. We ourselves lived and experienced these communities for brief periods of time, but each of these folks in these pictures, many of whom hailed from these very regions, spent many months and even years in these communities, getting folks to trust them, attending community events, interviewing the very poorest citizens in the communities, along with some of the most advantaged. While we were doing that ethnographic work, one of our team members sent us this map. So the sepia tone map is the rate of enslaved persons in 1860, as measured by the U.S. Census. And of course, the right-hand map there, or it's my right, I don't know if it's your right, is our own map. They are the same. The very gradations of disadvantage today can be traced all the way back to the percentage of enslaved people and the production of two cash crops, cotton and tobacco, most principally cotton. So this is when we learned, oh wow, it's not enough to use big data to identify these places. It's not enough to go talk to people, participate in community lives. We need to understand history. And through this mix of ethnography, big data, history, getting ideas on the ground, listening to people, and then going back to big data to test some of these ideas that emerged from the on-the-ground work, we identified 7 or 8 mechanisms that actually tie these places to their decades-old histories, sometimes centuries-old histories, as America's most disadvantaged places. I'm going to probably come back to this slide in a minute. I want to just put it up there so we can think about some of these things. But first, I want to say something about housing. Now, people often say to us, people who are really into the poverty measurement wars, and they are vicious. They say, well, you shouldn't focus on rural America. That's silly. Because everyone knows the cost of living is really low there. Rent burden is really low. And it's really in the cities where people are suffering. In fact, one of our national measures of poverty, the supplementary poverty measure, considers cost of living quote unquote, and tells us that California is in more need than Mississippi. So this is what I say. I say, well, we've done our own calculations, and it turns out that the people in the most disadvantaged places have the same rent burden as people in rich places. But I've never really had a convincing visual representation of that fact. Luckily, this morning, Jonathan, my co-host here, sent me the following map produced by this organization. This is housing affordability concerns in 1980. California, and this is 2020. This is a jaw-dropping map, and what it shows is that the most disadvantaged rural places, the Cotton Belt, the Tobacco Belt, Central Appalachia, South Texas, also have the greatest housing affordability concerns, on par in many cases with high-cost urban areas. I'm going to leave it there. Maybe go back and put those mechanisms on the screen. And I'm going to invite Jonathan to join the conversation. And we're going to talk with you about some of the things we've been thinking about in response to this book.
Great. So just testing the mic, sounds like it's working. I want to just note that we are headed into the most dreaded part of a plenary, which is the dessert and digestion piece. And I've been looking at the cheesecake there, but there's two things that I want to do to encourage you, to not lose energy. First and most important, we will be starting the conversation, but really want this to be a conversation with you all, and we have a mic set up. So start, please, thinking about your questions. And the second thing is, and I thought this was a little odd, but Professor Edin insisted that we do a pop quiz on your book, on her book before the end of the conference. So you have until tomorrow.
I'm a teacher.
Yes. So pay attention. That's a joke. Don't worry. But please do get ready with some questions. But I am going to start. Here's a big shock. You're at the National Rural Housing Conference. I'm not going to let you just say a word about rural housing. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about what you encountered in terms of housing, not just in terms of affordability, but other issues. And in particular, you shared that as a poverty researcher, you were surprised at the geographic imprint. Was there anything that, as someone who's a secret housing researcher too, not so secret, surprised you in that respect?
So I've been in a lot of, is this working? Great. So I've been in a lot of urban places, and I've visited many of the nation's most notorious housing developments. I cut my teeth as a young researcher in Cabrini Green and Robert Taylor homes. And I have to say that visiting South Texas, maybe the most dramatically, was really a revelation. I had not known that the quality of housing could be so poor. It was very striking. I remember driving around the south side of Greenwood, Mississippi, another one of our sites, and seeing these houses, literally shacks, on pilings where you could see through the exterior wall bars into the insides of the homes. Marion County, South Carolina. Same story in a little town called Sellers, mainly black hamlet. The housing quality was so poor that when Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence came to that area back to back, these houses were defenseless. But also because they were deemed worthless from a real estate point of view, they were not eligible for many sources of federal relief. So I think, few Americans imagine that you might see a whole row of houses in Sellers, South Carolina, that still have privies. But as you know, that does remain true in some cases. And I think the vulnerability, especially in these areas where These areas are more prone to climate-related disasters than any other regions in our nation. And so the fact that the housing is so fragile really makes these communities even more vulnerable than they would have been otherwise. And the second thing is just how much, despite the quality of the housing, people were paying. Maybe one other dynamic I would mention, and this is especially true in the Cotton Belt and in central Appalachia, is there is a tradition of returning home to retire. But there is also the fact that the housing that is available is somewhat affordable, and it makes it hard for people to leave. Where are you going to go and replace your housing of that quality somewhere else? So you tend to see a very aging profile of populations in these places. And those folks have a harder time, maintaining their homes.
Great. And I'll just add, when you were discussing the quality of the housing, which is something that we know is really an issue in rural areas, I do think it's incredibly important to show how much of the country is not like Washington, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And I mention this because prior to working at HUD, I worked on the Hill during the last financial crisis, 2008, 2009, which we thought was going to be the biggest crisis we faced in our career. And what was striking was you had issues of foreclosure and issues of blight. And we know that those issues and housing quality exist in rural America, but mentioning that I was from Buffalo, those Rust Belt cities, It was striking when we would have congressional hearings and members of Congress, including then Chair Maxine Waters of the Housing Subcommittee, would hear what the houses were worth or not worth and how they were dealing with blight. And there was sort of a sense of like, hey, welcome to our world. Your world in the blue bubbles is not the same from a housing perspective. But I want to move from housing. One of the phrases you have there is social infrastructure. And on my first trip back home from college to Buffalo, I had a job. I was on a demolition site of a bowling alley. The bowling alley near my house that I grew up going on field trips and my family would go bowling in. And I noticed that sort of bowling alleys play a little bit of a role in this book. And I think at that time, that was around when Robert Putnam at Harvard started talking about bowling alone. And I think that book and others talked about social capital. And we talk a lot about physical infrastructure. And you kind of combine these. So what do you mean by social infrastructure and the laws?
So my office used to be right above Bob Putnam's office at the Kennedy School at Harvard. So I think I imbued some vibes from Bob and his wonderful work. So we were in Central Appalachia talking to folk about the opioid crisis. And to a person, they all had a diagnosis for why the opioid crisis was so prevalent and indeed virulent there. Over 250 prescriptions for every man, opioid prescriptions for every man, woman, child in the county at the height of the crisis, and still that figure is 130. And of course now it's illegal rather than prescription opioids that are really driving overdose and death. And they would say, well, there's nothing to do here but drugs. Over and over again, they'd say there's nothing to do, nothing for the young people to do. That's why they go to drugs. And so we were like, oh, please. But when you hear something over and over again, you have to take it seriously. So we said to ourselves, what if it's not really that the bowling league, that people aren't joining bowling leagues, which is what Putnam argued. What if the real problem is that there are no bowling alleys at all? And what if the disappearance of these places, right? Social infrastructure is the places that wide swaths of community members come together in to create the social bonds that then catch people when they fall. And when social bonds are rich, social isolation is reduced, and the whole community is healthier. So we actually put this to an empirical test. We got a great census data set that allowed us to look at declines in social infrastructure All rural communities are facing this to some degree, but in these areas, the declines are much greater. And what we see is a strong relationship between that decline and the rise over time in opioid deaths and all kinds of other social maladies. For housing, I think what's relevant here is that without social infrastructure, people really are trapped in their homes. It's not like you're just sleeping and eating there and then you can go to a public venue or a senior center or some other place where you can interact and sort of revive your sense of community membership. You are really isolated and alone in your own homes. And we see a strong relationship between the loss of social infrastructure and the social isolation of people living in these very disadvantaged places.
Thank you. In some ways, I sort of think that the challenge we're talking about here is he talked about bowling alone. You're talking about streaming alone and no place to go bowling. Just to, not on commission from Robert Putnam, but I happened to, his next book was called Our Kids, which was about the deterioration in his hometown of a sense of collective responsibility for children. And I appreciate having the PowerPoint in front of me. And by the way, people get warmed up because this is going to be the last one or the second to last question that I'm asking. But can you talk a little bit about the separate and unequal schools? Because I think that reflects a sort of sense of like, there's our children and their children.
So in Greenwood, Mississippi, a tiny town of about 13,000 people, there are 5 high schools. How did this happen? Well, it turned out that, Brown v. Board didn't get actually implemented, shall we say, in Mississippi till the early 1970s. Alexander v. Holm finally put the Mississippi educators' feet to the fire. And so for a brief moment there, Mississippi schools and schools all across the continent and the tobacco belts into Appalachia, these are all segregated places, began to integrate. But in defiance of this law, the South in particular stood up hundreds and hundreds of segregation schools, all white academies that often literally stole not only the school books, the school buses, the desks and chairs from the public schools, but also the mascots, the very spirit of the public schools. Many of these places exist today, and if you're in a state that has a universal voucher program, tax dollars are going to send kids to those schools. Those same schools now have, non-discrimination clauses, but the fraction of black kids or brown kids in those schools is minuscule. So what has happened, right, is that there's no public support for, you all know this story, right? There's no support for the public schools. The public schools end up being D and F rated. It's a little bit different in Appalachia, where uneven funding across the state has rendered the rural schools virtually, destitute compared to the urban schools. So much so that Kentucky's own Supreme Court rendered the whole system unconstitutional. So in each of these places, there are different mechanisms to keep our kids and their kids apart. And this is a death sentence for rural places. Because you start out with this idea that you're going to maintain your white population because they don't have to go to school with non-white kids. But over time, what corporation is going to relocate there as you try to industrialize after cotton is no longer king? Will, a company from Milwaukee come down to your state and say, sure, I'll send my kids to Pillow Academy. That's great. No. So over time, the failing public schools, and by the way, the private schools were never that good either, and the fact that there are literally no white kids in the public schools really begins to degrade a community's ability to attract new business and really new people. So the only people coming to these places are people who are coming back to these places, not new blood and new energy.
Great. So I really mean it this time. I want to see, I'm going to ask one more thing so people can make their way to the microphone. We have one set up here so everybody can hear. So please, unless you want to just hear us keep talking, make your way there. But I do want to point out, I don't know if it was the mayor of Greenwood, but it was the mayor of one of the places that you visited that sort of, talked about, when asked, well, what about this gulf? And said, well, that's a parenting issue. There's nothing we can do about it. And it just was really striking because as someone just thinking about money from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the community development block grant, other things, which in that case I think was really going to beautify the downtown and continue the, and so I guess my question here is to talk a little bit about, you have the bullet there of corruption, but I'm gonna make it broader. And let me just be clear. I think in a circumstance in which Senator Menendez had half a million in cash in his house, and we have a Supreme Court justice who feels comfortable taking trips from billionaires, that corruption is not just a rural issue or something that I think in some big cities was sort of like, yeah, that was a 1970s, 1980s thing. It's there, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about the role of corruption and sort of the power elite, I guess I would.
So first of all, Carolyn McAdams is not corrupt as far as I know. She's the mayor of Greenwood.
Oh, right.
But we found cases of corruption that were jaw-dropping in every one of these places. Every one of these places also has hometown heroes, people who stand up to fight corruption, and there's some really powerful stories of that in the book. But oftentimes the local leadership of these places are literally from the same families who were the first capitalists in these areas, the people who controlled the land and the resources, and left a vast sea of landless workers at their mercy. So these same people found out that controlling land and resources and politics, especially local politics, was a very powerful way to continue to extract resources from rural places. And so in Zavala County, Texas, we have almost everyone in the city government, including the mayor, leaving one city councilman without an indictment, thrown in jail. Over in Brooks County, which is kind of on the other end of South Texas, we have the mayor thrown in jail for an illegal gambling scheme. That's very big in South Texas, so it's not just her county, but she got caught. Then over in Marion, South Carolina, there's all kinds of corruption, really, state leaders taking money to quote unquote provide jobs in Marion County, but the jobs never materialized, although the leaders got the subsidies. And then of course the case that did start in Greenwood, Mississippi, and that is the welfare scandal that ended up engulfing Brett Favre. So corruption is big. You all know this, right? You all know this. And we can't, one thing you said to me is that you were really struck by the fact that these places weren't uniformly poor. They also had great wealth. One thing that's really characteristic of these places is that they're very high in inequality. So we call a measure of inequality the Gini index. And the Gini index is as high in Greenwood, Mississippi as it is in New York City. So haves and have-nots. And the haves, of course, control the politics. So elite capture in these places is real. When money comes from the federal government or the state government down to these little towns, not all of it gets where it's supposed to go, shall we say. And that has been true for a very, very long time. So really politics is a way that elites have, again, we have the hometown heroes, but elites have really used to continue to extract resources even when King Cotton, King Coal, and even Popeye, we write about the spinach industry, bow to mechanization and foreign competition. Okay, we need some people up at that mic.
So here's the thing. I refer to myself as a recovering lawyer. And in law school, you lived in fear of professors who would use the Socratic method and cold call people. So this is the last warning. I'm looking at you, Nick Mitchell-Bennett, and the rest of the hack board. Oh, good. We see somebody approaching the mic. Please, and what I will say is, I hope You can hear two requests for the question, sort of having begged for questions. I'm now going to offer two caveats, which is one, and I say this to out myself, please have a question. I know Halloween is coming, but I used to be the king of the comment disguised as a question. Please ask a question, and no more than one subpart to the question. Thank you. And please introduce yourself and where you're from. Thank you. Go ahead.
All right. Can you hear me okay? All right. I'm Jacqueline Gottlieb, and I'm from Hayesville, North Carolina, which is in the Appalachian region. And when you were talking and making your comments about there's nothing else to do in the community, interesting, because I hear that all the time in our community. But what I want to know is, did you include ACE scores in your research, and how that's playing out in those really poverty-stricken or?
So these are the ACEs.
Yes.
Yes. So unfortunately, we need to stick with, we wrote a lot.
Can we say what those are?
So ACEs are early childhood adversity scores. It's a very, very useful research tool. And in our prior book, $2 a Day, we write extensively about the role of ACEs. But the problem is they're not measured reliably for every city and county in the U.S. Having said that, it is, shall we say, almost a sacred experience to sit with a family and to hear about the sources of intergenerational trauma. But in every one of these counties, there's been pushback and revolt, and people have stood up and said enough is enough. And really, if you look at these four regions, these are the cradle of the civil rights movement. These were the places where voting rights were secured for millions of people. So there are also stories in each of these places of great pride. One of the ways voting rights were secured in South Texas for Hispanics were the actions of 4 cheerleaders, and we tell their stories in the book, and we interviewed all of them in 1969, who staged a walkout of the entire school because of how the Hispanic children were being treated. They came to Washington. They met with Ted Kennedy and Senator Yarborough. The federal government put pressure on the town, and finally, those students were able to secure a fair shot in their schools. So it's just a humbling and it's a great honor to receive these stories and to try to make sense of them. So folks like you are the people who can say, yeah, I've heard that. There's nothing to do here but drugs. But what about the trauma?
Right.
So I really appreciate that comment.
Thank you. Thank you for that question.
Hi, I'm Gina Capone, and I'm from Maryland. I just wanted you to talk about investors in the real estate market and how that has changed or caused maybe the inequity in the housing market, and why are the laws allowed or legislated against just the common person, where investors can come together and take over a market. And what are we doing to counteract that as a group? Because I believe, as a title examiner, I see title that just is unbalanced, and people that own property and developers are one thing, but just that group of investors, why is now the prime time that we're bringing in people like that into our housing market when people don't have homes or they can't afford homes?
So I have to admit, I'm going to ask those of you at this conference to school me on the situation in rural America. I am PI, one of the largest studies of investors in 4 cities, along with Stephanie DeLuca, Philgar Bowden, Eva Rosen, and Meredith Greif. And investors come in all stripes. shapes and sizes. So in Cleveland, you know, it's a mom and pop town. It's a mom and pop town in Baltimore, Maryland as well. When you go down to Dallas, Texas, it's a corporate town. And you have these, and it's partly because of the housing stock. It's partly because of the way, you know, the value of a voucher, the FMR. I mean, there's all kinds of things at play. And then, of course, Washington, D.C., where you're seeing big-time investors sort of gobble up a lot of the mom and pops that had been there. So tell me what's happening in rural America. In our ethnography, we did see, so the state in Appalachia and Eastern Kentucky is investing a lot in trying to create sort of a tourist culture in this environmentally degraded area of the former coal fields, and with some success. But the buildings downtown that house the most vulnerable people, that's an eyesore. So those buildings get demolished, right? Eminent domain is declared, or you know, the owner sells the property to the city at a minuscule cost. Those buildings are razed, and those people cannot get housing in their hometown. So people in Manchester who this happened to, many of them will likely have to move to London, which is 40 minutes by car away, and be divorced from their support networks that have kept them going for many years. So that's all I can say about that topic, but yes, we do know that more of the market is getting controlled by corporate investors, and we also know that the mom and pops are better at keeping people housed. They're more flexible, they're more sympathetic. There's definitely a range of motivations out there among these mom and pops. But mom and pops are good for economically marginal people. So we want to find out more about how we can help their business models maintain some level of economic viability. They don't have the economies of scale that the big players do.
And just to add a couple of real quick things, because I want to make sure we get to these questions, but I'm happy to follow up. As someone involved in public policy, certainly since the Great Recession, have been working to provide tools to CDFIs and the public sector to be able to compete with investors. I mean, I can tell you right now that the CDFI industry, we could spend any amount of acquisition lending money that we can get our hands on, because I look back when I was on the Hill, we passed in the last recession a $5 billion neighborhood stabilization fund, and that helped give birth to the National Community Stabilization Trust that has been working for years. But to just give a sense of scale, over a 5-year period, Blackstone spent $10 billion themselves gobbling up rental housing. So it's really, in addition to supporting mom and pops, we have to give the mission-driven and the public sector folks tools that are on the scale. Next question.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Michael Daniels, and I traveled here from Anchorage, Alaska.
Wow.
And myself and a few others. And to get directly to the question, when we were reviewing your maps earlier and your charts, we noticed that Alaska wasn't represented on that map, and that happens a lot. So, which leads me to the question: if you had data, and if our state was researched along your journey and providing injustice and poverty, and if not, we are here to provide information.
So if you go on the web, you will see that I don't know how Alaska and Hawaii got cut off of this map, but they're there. And Alaska's an interesting case. It has a large cluster of very disadvantaged places. We could have, if we had the wherewithal, we would have included it as a site. The expertise, honestly, was also a problem. But there is one community, one county that's majority Native American that is actually one of the most advantaged counties as well. So from what I can tell, this county has oil drilling money. They sell oil drilling leases. And the tribal government has put that money to really good use to diversify the economy in very meaningful ways. And the fate of that place has really turned around. So, you know, I wish I could retrieve the name of the county from the top of my head, but I don't want to make a mistake. But what Alaska shows, I think, is that even in a place with very deep disadvantage, if there is a resource like oil, good government and low corruption can really turn that place around. So thank you, Alaska, for that opportunity.
Right.
We also left out Puerto Rico because we literally could not get data for Puerto Rico. But we mean to fix that problem in the future.
Hi, my name is Brianna. I'm from Hampton, Virginia. And I am excited to read the book, but I wondered if you could speak more to the protective measures or trends that you found in the communities that were kind of on edge. Like, was there a difference between those and the ones that were on the list? And specifically, was like the presence of a local media any part of that?
So local media is incredibly important, but also nonprofit media, because in some sense, local newspapers are often operated at the behest of local elites, right? So what we found is that some local media is just excellent, but nonprofit media is really pulling, it's punching way above its weight. So 2 reporters, one from the Clarion Ledger in the Mississippi Delta and in the community of Greenville, and Mississippi Today's Anna Wolf, really ferreted out the story of an $80 million scandal that took money from America's poorest children, right? 97% of TANF applicants were being rejected in the state, and literally lining the pockets of residents of LaFleur County, state officials, and some nonprofits. They were nonprofits, that's correct. But also all of these celebrity athletes from the state. Over 50 people, I think, have been indicted, either civilly or criminally. So that was, you know, and Anna Wolf has now won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. So we really need to bolster our local media. So if you rely on Alabama.com, which is another really, Alabama.com has done a really great job of talking about the infrastructure in the Black Belt, the inadequate water infrastructure. That's very powerful stories. They've talked about the political scandal in Hale County. So when you go on those, do donate, as they're really doing an outsized job. And again, that's directly fighting corruption. So this is an independent tool that we can use to dampen or challenge corruption in a way that's very public and can lead to change.
Right, thank you.
Hi, Alan Nazaro with RCAC, and you mentioned earlier, and I'm from Colorado, you mentioned earlier the disproportionate climate impacts on disadvantaged communities, and that's one of the reasons RCAC started a program to help our client rural and indigenous communities with disaster-related planning, preparation, mitigation, and recovery. But because we noticed that we all know that rural and indigenous communities have the least capacity and resources to do daily operations, let alone answer to climate impacts. But my question is, we also know that there's systemic problems with the federal government programs that, you know, don't allow these under-capacity and under-resourced communities to access federal funds. And we, as a nonprofit with some resources, have difficulty getting resources to help them get resources. So the question is, what can we do about those systemic issues with the federal government? And is that in your book? Because I haven't read it, the whole thing yet. I just started it. So.
Well, toward the end of the book, there is a whole chapter on this very topic. When we went to Marion County, South Carolina, these back-to-back hurricanes plus a 100-year flood had just ravaged these two little towns of Sellers and Nichols. And what we noticed over time as we were spending time in the community is that, the communities in Nichols, which is mostly white, beautiful new homes were going up. Whereas in Sellers, the homes were just left moldering, often with sick and asthmatic and other health-compromised individuals living just in this sea of mold because there was nowhere else to go. And what we document is all of the ways in which FEMA and other agencies meant to help actually increased the disparity between these two places so that the white community actually ended up doing better after these back-to-back storms, whereas as the little black town virtually disappeared. It is, almost uninhabitable. And it turns out that over and over again, you can document that when disaster hits a mixed-race community, the white neighborhood tends to do better. The white community tends to actually gain in value, whereas the communities of color go the opposite direction. And so what we suggest in this book is some sort of an audit. We want the federal agencies to do a systematic audit to make sure that the systemic racism that is just woven in, heirs property is a big source of this, as you might imagine, woven into so many of these policies. We need to shine a light on that, but we also need federal agencies to say to themselves, can I responsibly administer aid and still ensure equity? So we were with Representative Clyburn yesterday, and he said, if after a disaster we give the white community $100,000 and the black community $100,000, even then, what you're going to see is, the black community has all these infrastructure problems, so we're going to have to fix all that. And they're still not going to get, the lighting in the streets and the roads paved. In the white community, you've got all that infrastructure already. And so you can see visible improvements. So that was an interesting perspective. Even when the funding is equivalent, sometimes it can have a disparate impact. But usually it is not. And in the case of Sellers and Nichols, the white community received 4 times the amount of money in disaster relief than the black community did.
And that's it. We'll get to the last 2 questions, but I just want to make the point. First of all, Alan, I have read the book, and when you asked your question, I was like, oh, thank goodness he asked the question I'd forgotten to ask. And just to cite one statistic in there, which I hadn't seen before, but is consistent with everything we always say when we push for capacity building and the change in federal distribution of resources, is there was an audit of all federal placemaking resources up through 2015 that essentially showed the correlation between assistance and the number of nonprofits, i.e. the number of grant writers that you have available, which is, that's not the way you want to run a railroad, so to speak. So we are certainly involved in a number of ways in trying to change that, but I want to make sure we get to our last 2 folks before we finish up lunch.
Hello, my name is Andre Ivanov, and I'm from Vancouver, Washington. Our nonprofit focuses on housing, turning homes from burnt trees from all the forest fires that we've had in Oregon. But to the question that I wanted to get to, we know that poverty and problems are often so multi-layered, and it's easy to kind of isolate one issue and be like, well, that's the thing. Haven't had a chance to read your book, looking forward to it. And the question is fetal alcohol a contributor to the poverty aspects in the book? Like, is that one of the factors?
Not in these places. These places show all kinds of elevated health risk. It's astonishing. But fetal alcohol is not one of them. You do see in South Texas the only health condition in South Texas that's elevated, in contrast to Appalachia, the Tobacco Belt, and the Cotton Belt, is cirrhosis of the liver. But as far as we can tell, it's due more to lack of exercise and diet than to large consumption of alcohol. So that is not necessarily a story of these places, but it's certainly an important story nationally.
Great.
Hi there. My name is Marisela Hernandez, and I'm here from El Paso, Texas. I also work for a nonprofit. Thank you so much for everything that you guys are doing. I haven't had a chance to read your book yet either. Maybe this, your book would answer my question, but it's like a two-parter. Is there documentation of mortgage discrimination in rural areas, and is there any data-driven articles of the relationship of housing, health, and minorities that we can use if we're bettering our community?
Housing discrimination?
Pardon me?
What kind of discrimination?
Like discrimination in rural areas of any kind. It could be, race or income, any kind. Do you have any?
So this kind of goes back to this point that these areas are some of the most unequal areas in our country, and there's huge stigma. So if you ask any, not necessarily the hometown heroes, but almost any civic leader in these communities, what's wrong with your community? You know what they'll say? Now, they may have had the biggest corruption scandal in their history. They may have failing schools. They say, oh, those poor people, they just don't behave very well. And if you're in Appalachia, they'll say, yeah, parents coach their kids to do badly in schools so they can get the stupid checks. One local leader told Nicholas Kristoff, in first grade they have a dream, by fourth grade they have a plan. And so there's this really disdain for the have-nots on the part of the haves is a very, so you were mentioning, this was true of Carolyn McAdams. We talked about the violence in her community. This is another common trait of these places. They tend to be among the most violent in the country, as violent as the south side of Chicago, in fact. And we were asking her about this, and she said, oh, it's the parenting. You know, those poor people just don't know how to parent. So there is this just calcified divide, and it's not just economic, but it's really moral. This is not to say that people on the other side of that divide are immoral, right? They go to church on Sunday too. It's the sense that all of the problems of these places can be laid at the feet of the poor, and that's sufficient to explain the problem. Now, if you define your problem in that way, you'll never get to your housing problems. You'll never get to your sewer problems.
Yep.
Great question.
Great question. I can follow up offline. Yes, there's evidence of mortgage discrimination, but just to finish up, I want to highlight, just the persistence of what I often call the dependency myth here. Like the irony of it is, I'm looking over at HAC CEO David, who knows I love pop culture references, so I'm going to close with one. But the year of HAC's founding, 51 years ago, then President Nixon invited Johnny Cash to the White House and wanted him to sing a top 40 song at the time called Welfare Cadillac. And I think it is relevant that a major song this summertime, Rich Men North of Richmond, continues this myth, while at the same time what we sort of hear that the real dependency on the public sector is often among families that have
a lot of resources.
That have a lot of resources that have corrupted that. But I think what we've also heard, I want to thank you, is the incredible hope that you found, and as you put it, hometown heroes, and what we can do to support them.
Every community has people coming back who have gotten credentialed elsewhere and become successful. And they've decided, I'm going to go back to Marion County. I'm going to go back to Greenwood, Mississippi. I'm going to open a charter school. I'm going to revive the community center that I went to when I was a kid. You see this over and over again. They're the future leaders. And so whatever we can do to be a wind under the wing of these old timers who are newcomers and bringing fresh ideas to these places. We should be doing that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor
Thank
Edin. Let me just make sure, while David is HAC CEO, Terry is the CEO of this conference. I want to make sure that if there's anything logistical that we need to Oh, there she comes. Okay, don't do anything until Terry tells you.
So we've got two really cool things happening following this plenary. Of course, there are the outstanding workshop sessions that are going to be kicking off, but we also have Kathryn who's staying with us for a few moments to do book signing. And then certainly last but not least, we are also going to be selling raffle tickets for our quilts. You will be seeing them as you exit the workshop sessions this afternoon. So with that said, we want to thank Kathryn Edin again and Jonathan for the job well done. And as you exit to my right, your left, the table will be outside the ballroom doors, so meet Kathryn that way. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. That was